homeless man asked Barron Trump for just $1. But what happened next left everyone speechless. Instead of walking away, Barron made an unexpected decision that would change a life forever. What did he do? Why did his actions spark a nationwide conversation? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The city of Cleveland pulsed with restless energy. Cars honked impatiently, their tires splashing through the remnants of last night's cold drizzle. Pedestrians hurried along the cracked sidewalks, their breath visible in the crisp winter air. The towering buildings loomed over them, casting long shadows over the streets, where life moved too fast for anyone to notice the man sitting slumped against the side of a weathered convenience store. Leonard, 42 years old, sat wrapped in layers of mismatched, tattered clothing, his beanie pulled low over his ears to block out the biting wind. His hands, rough and cracked from months of exposure, clutched at a flimsy piece of cardboard with 3 simple words scrawled in black marker. "Anything helps. God bless." He wasn't holding out hope for much. A few coins, maybe a spare sandwich, maybe, if he was lucky, a person who would meet his eyes instead of pretending he was invisible. The streets had not been kind to Leonard. He had once been someone, a factory worker with a steady paycheck, a roof over his head, and a future. But that was before the plant shut down, before the eviction notices, before his body betrayed him with the kind of pain that made physical labor impossible. The world had moved on without him, leaving him here, just another forgotten soul blending into the urban decay. People walked by, their polished shoes and designer heels clicking against the pavement. Not one of them stopped. They never did. Until someone did. Leonard's weary eyes caught something unusual. A pair of pristine white sneakers, the kind that didn't belong on the feet of someone rushing to work or running errands. No, these were expensive, unscaffed, and they weren't moving. The feet inside them were planted, just a few feet away from him, still as stone. Curious, Leonard lifted his head. Standing before him was a tall, lean teenager, his posture composed, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of a sleek, tailored jacket. There was something striking about him, not just his height or his youthful face, but the way he carried himself. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't avoiding eye contact. He wasn't rushing to get away. Leonard squinted against the morning light, feeling an odd familiarity stir in the back of his mind. The boy's features, the carefully styled hair, the quiet yet commanding presence. It was as if Leonard had seen him before, though he couldn't immediately place where. The young man wasn't speaking. He wasn't looking at his phone or pretending not to see Leonard. He was just standing there, observing him in a way that felt unsettlingly personal. Leonard hesitated. He rarely spoke first. He had learned long ago that asking for help often led to nothing but rejection. But something about the boy made him reconsider. Maybe it was the way he wasn't walking away. Maybe it was the simple fact that for the first time in what felt like forever, someone was actually seeing him. Taking a steadying breath, Leonard forced a small, tired smile and spoke. "Hey, young man," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Could you spare $1?" The moment stretched longer than Leonard expected. The boy tilted his head slightly, as if considering something far deeper than the simple question he had been asked. Then, slowly, he turned to face Leonard fully. His expression was unreadable. Not pity, not disgust, just curiosity. And then, in a voice far steadier than Lino had anticipated, the boy asked a question that caught him completely off guard. "What do you need it for?" The words weren't cruel, they weren't dismissive, but they carried a weight Leonard hadn't been expecting. For a man who had spent a year being ignored, this was the first time someone actually wanted an answer. Leonard hadn't expected a conversation. He had expected what he always got. A passing glance, a hasty shake of the head, maybe a mumbled "sorry" from someone already looking past him. But this was different. The boy. Barron, though Leonard still hadn't realized who he was, stood in front of him, completely unbothered by the curious glances of the passing pedestrians. Unlike the others, he wasn't avoiding eye contact or pretending not to hear. He had asked a simple question, but his tone wasn't judgmental, just steady, expectant. Leonard swallowed, his throat dry. "A cup of coffee," he finally muttered, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Maybe a sandwich, if I'm lucky." Barron didn't respond right away. Instead, he tucked his phone into his pocket and crouched down, not in some dramatic, over-exaggerated way, but with an ease that told Leonard he wasn't concerned about ruining his designer clothes. That simple act startled Leonard more than anything. People never crouched. They never put themselves at his level. For the first time in what felt like years, Leonard wasn't looking up at someone. "What's your name?" Barron asked, his voice calm. Leonard hesitated. A part of him wanted to lie, to make up a name, to keep himself at a distance, the way he always did. But something about this kid's presence made that impossible. "Leonard," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron nodded, as if committing the name to memory. "I'm Barron." That name triggered something, an echo in Leonard's mind. The way the bystanders had started whispering, the way some had discreetly raised their phones. But he didn't have time to piece it together before Barron spoke again. "How long have you been out here?" Leonard exhaled slowly. He hated talking about it, hated admitting how far he had fallen, but for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself answering honestly. "Almost a year now," he said. His fingers tightened around the edges of his tattered coat, as if trying to shield himself from the weight of the words. "Lost my job when the plant shut down. Then my health took a hit, couldn't keep up with the rent. And, well, here I am." He let out a hollow chuckle, the kind that carried no humor. "Been downhill ever since." Barron listened carefully, not interrupting, not checking his phone, not shifting uncomfortably the way most people did when forced to acknowledge suffering. He was just there, listening. Leonard wasn't used to that. "What about family?" Barron asked after a moment. Leonard stiffened. That was a sore spot. "Not much of that anymore," he muttered. "My parents passed a while back, and my brother," he hesitated, then sighed. "We haven't spoken in a long, long time." The weight of those words sat between them. For a moment, Leonard thought the conversation was over, that Barron would nod, maybe hand him a couple of dollars and walk away. But instead, the teenager reached into his pocket. Leonard's pulse quickened. He had asked for $1, just one. But Barron wasn't pulling out a few crumpled bills. When his hand reappeared, it held a crisp, clean $100 note. Leonard's breath hitched. He stared at the money, his brain struggling to process the moment. This had to be a mistake. "Are you serious?" he finally managed, his voice unsteady. Barron gave a small shrug, as if this wasn't anything unusual. "Because I can." The words weren't boastful, they weren't laced with arrogance or pity. They were simple, direct, a statement of fact. Leonard's hands trembled as he reached for the bill, still half expecting Barron to pull it back at the last second, to laugh and walk away. But he didn't. He just watched, studied Leonard in that same thoughtful, unreadable way. But before Leonard could shove the money into his pocket, Barron leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "This isn't just about the money," he said. "I need you to promise me something." Leonard frowned, his fingers tightening around the bill. "What is it?" Barron's expression grew serious. "If I help you today, you have to help yourself tomorrow. Deal?" Leonard felt something shift inside him. People had given him money before, rarely, but it had happened. What they never gave him was expectation, hope, a push. This kid wasn't just handing him cash, he was handing him accountability. Leonard swallowed hard, his throat tight. For the first time in a long, long while, someone wasn't treating him like a lost cause. "Deal," he whispered. Barron studied him for another moment, then reached into his pocket again. Not for more money, but for a small notepad and a pen. He scribbled something down, then tore off the page and handed it to Leonard. "Be at this address tomorrow morning," he said. "They'll help you. Tell them Barron sent you." Leonard unfolded the note, his hand still shaking. It was an address. A shelter and resource center he had heard of, but had always been too ashamed to walk into. "I'll make sure they're expecting you," Barron added. Leonard stared at the paper. He had every excuse not to go, every reason to stay in his cycle of despair. But something about Barron's presence, his words, made it impossible to refuse. He nodded slowly. "I'll be there." Barron gave a small, satisfied smile. "Good." Then, without another word, he straightened up, glanced around at the onlookers, and slipped his hands back into his pockets. Leonard's gaze followed him as he walked away, his tall figure blending back into the rush of the city. For a long time, Leonard just sat there, staring at the crisp bill in his hand and the note on his lap. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the shelter address. It was the fact that, for the first time in what felt like forever, someone had looked at him and seen something more than just a man on the streets. For the first time in a long time, Leonard felt something stir inside him. Hope. The cold night air bit at Leonard's skin as he sat against the worn brick wall of the convenience store. The city moved around him, unaware of the storm raging inside his mind. The $100 bill rested tightly in his grip, as if letting go of it would make the whole interaction disappear like a dream. His other hand clutched the small piece of paper with the address Barron had given him. A part of him still questioned whether this was real. No one had ever looked at him the way Barron did, not with pity, not with disgust, but with an expectation. It rattled him more than the money itself. Strangers had dropped bills in his direction before, but never had someone taken the time to see him. Never had anyone crouched down, met his eyes, and handed him something more than $1. A second chance. Leonard exhaled sharply, rubbing his tired eyes. "Tomorrow morning," he murmured, staring at the address. It would have been easy to stuff the bill into his pocket, disappear into the night, and wake up the next morning in the same state he had been in for the past year, hopeless and resigned. But something in Barron's words stuck to him like glue. "If I help you today, you have to help yourself tomorrow. Deal?" Leonard had made a deal, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like breaking a promise to himself wasn't an option. The sky was still a shade of deep blue when Leonard arrived at the address. The Hope Outreach Resource Center sat in the middle of a quiet street, its exterior modest but welcoming. A small group of people stood near the entrance, some shifting uncomfortably, others gripping backpacks and duffel bags like lifelines. Leonard hesitated at the curb. He could still walk away. He could still convince himself that nothing would change, that this was just another fleeting moment of charity that would fade like all the others. But then he thought of Barron's eyes, steady, unwavering. "If I help you today, you help yourself tomorrow." With a deep breath, Leonard stepped forward. Inside, the warmth of the building was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper, the quiet hum of conversation filling the space. A woman at the front desk, middle-aged with soft brown eyes, looked up and smiled. "How can I help you?" she asked kindly. Leonard hesitated before reaching into his pocket, pulling out the folded paper. He slid it across the counter, clearing his throat. "Barron sent me." Her expression changed instantly. Recognition flickered in her eyes, and she reached for the note, glancing at it before nodding. "We've been expecting you." Leonard blinked. Expecting him? Before he could question it, she stood and motioned for him to follow. The next few hours passed in a haze. He met with a caseworker who spoke to him like a person, not a problem to be solved. They mapped out a plan, securing him a temporary bed in the shelter, scheduling a medical checkup, and even arranging a meeting with a job training program. For the first time in years, Leonard wasn't just another statistic. He wasn't being ignored. He was somebody. He sat on the edge of the cot in the small shelter dormitory, staring at his hands. The heaviness in his chest felt different now. It wasn't the weight of despair. It was something else, something lighter. Hope. Later that afternoon, as Leonard helped clean the shelter's common area, he overheard a hushed conversation between two volunteers. "That video of Barron is everywhere," one of them whispered. Leonard frowned, his hands pausing mid-scrub. "I know," the other said. "It's got millions of views now. People are calling him a role model. Some are even donating to the shelter because of him." Leonard's heart pounded. "Video?" He turned toward them. "What video?" The first volunteer blinked. "You haven't seen it?" She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen a few times before handing it to him. "It's all over social media." Leonard hesitated before pressing play. The footage was shaky, obviously recorded by a bystander. The city's noise filled the background, but the camera remained focused on him and Barron. Leonard watched himself sitting there, weary and worn, as Barron crouched down and spoke to him. The moment played back in clear detail. Barron handing him the $100 bill, the small piece of paper, and most importantly, those final words: "If I help you today, you help yourself tomorrow." The video ended, but Leonard remained frozen. Millions of people had seen this. People were talking about it. His chest tightened with something unfamiliar. Pride and fear tangled together. "Crazy, right?" the volunteer said, shaking her head. "Some people think it was staged, but most say Barron's the real deal. And you," she paused, studying him closely, "you're part of it." Leonard swallowed hard, gripping the phone like it might disappear. Part of it. For years he had felt like he was nothing, invisible to the world. Now, in just one moment, a stranger, a kid, had not only changed his life, but turned him into something bigger. A story. A symbol of what could happen when someone took a chance. Leonard exhaled slowly, handing the phone back. Barron hadn't just given him money, he had given him something far greater. A chance to rewrite his story. And for the first time in a long time, Leonard realized he wasn't going to waste it. Leonard sat on the edge of his cot in the shelter, staring at the phone screen long after the video ended. His own face stared back at him, hollow, tired, but undeniably present in what had become a national conversation. A part of him wanted to shut it all out, pretend he hadn't seen it, but another part, the one Barron had awakened, the part that still held on to the note in his pocket, whispered a different thought. "You're not invisible anymore." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face. This wasn't just about him anymore. That night, as he lay on the thin mattress, the whispers around the shelter were different than before. People had recognized him. They spoke his name now. They asked about Barron. Some were skeptical, others genuinely inspired. A few approached him cautiously, their voices laced with curiosity. "What's he really like? Did he say anything else? Man, you're lucky. Not everyone gets a second chance like that." But it wasn't luck, was it? Luck didn't kneel down in front of you and look you in the eyes. Luck didn't hand you a $100 bill and a challenge. Luck didn't tell you that your life still had value. Barron Trump had. The weight of that realization pressed on Leonard's chest. He had spent years believing his story had already been written, that his place in the world was set. But now, the world was watching. By morning, Leonard's world had changed again. The shelter's small lobby was flooded with reporters, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust forward as soon as he stepped into the common area. Shelter staff did their best to control the crowd, but the buzz had already taken on a life of its own. Leonard, what was it like meeting Barron Trump? How did it feel when he gave you the money? Do you think this was a publicity stunt?" The last question cut through the chaos like a knife. Leonard clenched his fists. He knew this was coming. Knew there would be people who doubted, who turned something real into a spectacle. But Barron hadn't been performing. Leonard had felt it. The weight in Barron's words, the sincerity in his gaze. It wasn't something that could be faked. Straightening his back, Leonard stepped forward, the cameras clicking furiously. "You all keep asking about the money," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. But that wasn't the important part. The crowd hushed slightly, leaning in. It wasn't about a $100 bill. It was about someone stopping, really stopping, and telling me that I still matter. For a moment, silence, then murmurs, a few nods. Someone jotted notes on a notepad. "Are you saying Barron Trump changed your life?" a reporter asked. Leonard considered the question. He could already see how it would be framed, either a sentimental headline or a cynical one. Finally, he answered, "He reminded me I could change it myself." As the media storm surrounding the video grew, the one person who hadn't made a statement was Barron Trump himself. News anchors debated his actions on morning shows. Social media was flooded with discussions. But Barron? He stayed quiet. Some people took his silence as a sign of authenticity. He didn't do this for attention. Others twisted it into something else. Why isn't he saying anything? Maybe he regrets it. In reality, Barron wasn't interested in the noise. While the internet dissected his every move, he sat in his family's Manhattan apartment, scrolling past the endless headlines. The video had reached millions, far more than he had expected. But instead of feeling proud, he felt restless. He had helped Leonard, but was it enough? That thought haunted him more than the media storm. After a long pause, Barron picked up his phone and dialed a number, the same one he had written down for Leonard. A staff member from Hope Outreach Resource Center answered. "I want an update on Leonard," Barron said, his voice calm but firm. "How's he doing?" The staff member hesitated before answering. "He's trying. He's doing well, actually. Your visit gave him a lot of momentum." Barron exhaled, a small weight lifting from his chest. "Good," he said. Then, after a pause, "I want to do more." What happened next was something neither Leonard nor Barron could have predicted. The Hope Outreach Resource Center started receiving donations. Small at first, then growing into something bigger. People across the country, inspired by the video, began reaching out to shelters in their own communities, volunteering, offering assistance. A viral challenge emerged, "Pay It Forward," for Leonard. Random acts of kindness spread like wildfire. People covered coffee orders for strangers, restaurants left meals outside for the homeless, job opportunities were extended to those in need. And at the center of it all, Leonard's story stood as proof of something simple, yet powerful. Small actions could spark real change. Leonard, now fully aware of the movement his moment with Barron had created, found himself in a position he had never imagined. The man who had once been invisible was now a symbol of resilience. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. One evening, after a long day of job training, Leonard sat in the shelter's common area, exhausted but hopeful. He had started to believe in himself again. He had begun thinking about his future. Then a voice cut through the quiet. "Leonard?" He turned. Standing in the doorway was someone he hadn't seen in over a decade. His younger brother, Paul. Leonard's heart nearly stopped. He hadn't spoken to Paul since their family had fallen apart. He had convinced himself that bridge had burned long ago. "I saw the video," Paul said, stepping closer. I had no idea things had gotten so bad for you." Leonard swallowed hard, emotions colliding in his chest. "I didn't make it easy to be found," he admitted. Paul exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, I should have looked harder." For a long moment, they just stood there, two men separated by years of silence, now brought back together by a single moment of kindness. Finally, Paul reached out, gripping Leonard's shoulder. "I'm here now," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in years, Leonard let himself believe it. Hope had brought him this far. Maybe it could bring him home again. Leonard sat in stunned silence, staring at his younger brother Paul as if he were seeing a ghost. It had been over a decade since they had last spoken. Years lost to pride, regret, and a lifetime of choices that had slowly pulled them apart. Paul looked different. Older. worn, in a way that made Leonard wonder if time had been just as hard on him. His eyes carried something unspoken, a quiet pain buried beneath layers of guilt. And yet, despite everything, there he was, standing in the doorway of the shelter, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, searching for the right words. I didn't think you'd want to see me," Paul admitted, shifting uncomfortably. Leonard swallowed, still trying to process the reality of this moment. After years of isolation, of feeling forgotten, his brother had come looking for him, and all because of that video. Because Barron Trump had stopped to listen. Finally, Leonard found his voice. "I didn't think anyone would." Paul exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Man, don't say that. You're my brother." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, as if speaking it aloud made him realize just how much weight it still carried. A beat of silence passed between them, thick with unsaid things. Leonard could feel the eyes of the shelter staff and a few residents lingering on them, but for once, he didn't care. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a reckoning. "Why now?" Leonard finally asked, his voice quieter than before. Paul hesitated. "Because I saw you. Not just on the news, not just in some viral video. I saw you, Leonard, and I realized how much time we've lost." He glanced around the shelter, his jaw tightening. "I should have been here for you sooner." Leonard studied him for a long moment, the anger and resentment that had once burned inside him now nothing more than dying embers. He had spent so long blaming the world, blaming himself for his downfall. But maybe Paul had suffered too. Maybe they had both been lost in different ways. His grip tightened around the note still tucked inside his pocket, the one Barron had given him with that simple challenge. "If I help you today, you have to help yourself tomorrow." Tomorrow had arrived, and suddenly, Leonard knew exactly what he had to do. "Let's get out of here," Leonard said, pushing himself to his feet. Paul blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "I want to show you something." Without waiting for a response, Leonard walked past his brother and toward the shelter's exit. The air outside was crisp, the kind of cold that cut straight through even the thickest layers. Paul followed, silent but watchful, his eyes darting toward Leonard, as if expecting him to fall apart at any moment. But Leonard didn't stumble. For the first time in years, he felt steady. They walked in silence for a few blocks before Leonard finally spoke. "You remember Broad Street?" Paul frowned. "Yeah, what about it?" "That's where it happened," Leonard said, his voice distant. "Where I met Barron." Paul's pace slowed slightly. "The video doesn't show everything, does it?" Leonard let out a short, bitter laugh. "Not even close." And so, as they walked through the city, Leonard told his brother everything. About the cold, about the shame, about how he had reached a point where asking for $1 had felt like all he could do, about the way Barron had looked at him, not with pity, not with disgust, but with something else entirely. Understanding. Hope. By the time they reached the intersection, Leonard stopped and gestured toward the spot where it had all happened. "Right there," he said. "That's where my life changed." Paul stood still, staring at the ground, as if trying to picture it himself. Leonard turned to face him. "I don't want to go back, Paul. I can't. But I can't do this alone either." For the first time since arriving, Paul's expression softened. "You don't have to." That night, Paul didn't leave. He stayed with Leonard at the shelter, sitting with him in the common area long after most of the residents had gone to bed. They talked about the past, about the things they had lost, the things they had broken, but more importantly, they talked about the future. "You need a job," Paul said bluntly. Leonard nodded. "I know." Paul hesitated for a moment before reaching into his pocket. "I might be able to help with that." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "I know a guy," Paul continued, "runs a construction company. They don't care about background checks, just whether or not you're willing to work." Leonard studied his brother, trying to gauge if this was pity or something else. "You really think they'd hire me?" Paul smirked. I think you've got a hell of a lot more to prove than most guys, and I think you're ready." Leonard exhaled slowly. Ready. He wasn't sure if he was. But maybe that didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was taking the first step. The next morning, Leonard woke up with something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. He got dressed, walked out of the shelter with Paul, and prepared to meet the man who might give him a chance to work again. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going back to the streets. And then, just as he and Paul reached the sidewalk, Leonard's phone vibrated. He had received a text from an unknown number. Leonard hesitated before opening it. "I heard you're doing good things. Keep going. Barron." Leonard stared at the screen, his throat tightening. Paul glanced over. "Who is it?" Leonard smiled. "Just someone who kept their promise." Leonard stood at the entrance of the construction site, staring at the towering machinery and the skeleton of a half-built building in the distance. The sound of metal clanging against metal, the hum of engines, and the shouts of workers echoed in his ears. He hadn't had a job in years, not a real one, not since the plant shut down and his life spiraled out of control. The weight of that realization pressed against his chest, making him feel both excited and terrified all at once. Beside him, Paul gave him a reassuring nudge. "Relax," he said, reading the tension in Leonard's face. "It's just work. You put in the effort, you get paid. No one's asking for miracles." Leonard let out a slow breath, forcing himself to nod. But deep down, it wasn't that simple. He wasn't just here to earn a paycheck. He was here to prove something. To himself, to Paul, and maybe even to the kid who had given him that $100 bill and a challenge. As they stepped forward, a stocky man in a hard hat and heavy-duty work gloves turned toward them. His gaze immediately locked onto Leonard, sizing him up. "So, this the guy you were talking about?" he asked Paul. "Yeah," Paul nodded. "Leonard. Hard worker, just needs a shot." The man, who introduced himself as Mike, crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Ever done construction before?" Leonard cleared his throat. "No, but I'm a fast learner." Mike let out a short laugh. "Haha, that's what they all say." He studied Leonard for another moment, then jerked his head toward a pile of lumber stacked on the ground. "All right, let's see what you got. Start hauling those boards over to the scaffolding. No complaints, no standing around. You do the work, you get paid. You don't, you're out." Leonard swallowed hard. Got it. The first few hours were brutal. The cold morning air did little to keep sweat from gathering at the back of Leonard's neck as he hauled plank after plank, his muscles straining with the effort. His hands, unaccustomed to the rough labor, burned with every lift, but he refused to stop. He could feel the eyes of the crew on him, watching to see if he'd crumble under the pressure, waiting for the moment he'd give up. He pushed through the pain, focusing on the rhythm of his steps, the weight of the wood in his hands, and the simple, grounding thought: one step at a time. Paul worked beside him, moving at an effortless pace, but every so often, Leonard caught him stealing glances his way, checking, making sure he was keeping up, making sure he wasn't breaking. Leonard gritted his teeth and kept moving. By midday, his arms felt like lead, and his breath came in short, sharp bursts. He hadn't worked this hard in years, and his body was screaming in protest. But just when he felt like his legs might give out beneath him, he heard a voice behind him. "Not bad, new guy." Leonard turned to find Mike standing there, arms crossed, his expression slightly less skeptical than before. "You're slow, but you're not lazy. That's a start." Leonard wiped the sweat from his brow. "I can get faster." Mike let out a short chuckle. "We'll see." He jerked his head toward the lunch break area. "Take 15, then get back to it." Leonard nodded, staggering toward a stack of crates where the other workers were already sitting. His hands shook as he reached for his water bottle, gulping down the cold liquid like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Paul sat down next to him, smirking. "So, still standing?" Leonard let out a breathless laugh. Paul clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing good, man. Just keep at it." Leonard nodded, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He frowned, pulling it out. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "Hope you're keeping that promise." Leonard stared at the message, his chest tightening. Barron. Somehow, he knew. Something about that text sent a surge of determination through Leonard. It wasn't just a check-in, it was a reminder that someone had believed in him when he didn't even believe in himself. He looked up at Paul. "I'm not going anywhere." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Huh." Leonard clenched his fists, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "I mean it. I'm not quitting. Not this time." Paul's smirk softened into something that almost looked like pride. "Good," he said. "Because I'd hate to have to kick your ass if you did." Leonard laughed, shaking his head. The break was over. It was time to get back to work. And for the first time in years, he wanted to. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Leonard had experienced in years. Each morning, he woke up in the shelter's small but clean dormitory, a far cry from the freezing pavement he had called home. He started his day before sunrise, pulling on his worn boots and heading out to the construction site. The first week had been brutal. His body ached in places he had forgotten existed. His hands were covered in blisters, and every night he collapsed into bed, barely able to move. But with each passing day, something inside him shifted. His body adapted, his endurance grew, and for the first time in a long time, he felt capable again. But it wasn't just the work, it was everything. The way the shelter staff greeted him by name every morning. The way Paul nudged him whenever he started doubting himself, reminding him that he had already come too far to turn back. The way the other workers at the site, who had once eyed him with skepticism, now nodded in approval as he hauled lumber and mixed concrete without complaint. And then there was Barron. Leonard still couldn't quite wrap his head around the fact that a billionaire's son had taken an interest in his life. But every few days, another text would come through. "Hope you're showing up. B. Home day at a time, keep at it. B. Still standing? Good. B." Short, simple messages. No fluff, no pity. Just a reminder that someone was watching, not to judge, but to see if Leonard would keep his word. And he had. What Leonard didn't realize was that his story was no longer just his. One evening, as he wiped the sweat from his forehead at the job site, Paul jogged over, holding out his phone with a grin. "Dude, have you seen this?" Leonard frowned, taking the phone. "Seen what?" Paul tapped the screen, and suddenly Leonard was staring at a video of himself. The grainy footage was from that day outside the convenience store, the moment Barron had crouched beside him, handed him a $100 bill and made him promise to try. The video had exploded across social media, racking up millions of views overnight. In the clip, Barron's voice was clear, firm, but encouraging. "If I help you today, you have to help yourself tomorrow. Deal?" Then there was Leonard, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." Barron's answer had stopped the internet in its tracks. "Because everyone has a story. Yours just hasn't been told yet." Leonard felt his stomach tighten as he scrolled through the thousands of comments. Some were skeptical, calling it a publicity stunt, but most were different. "This is how you use privilege. This kid gets it." That promise hit me hard. You can tell he really meant it. Imagine if more people with influence did things like this instead of just posting about awareness. What happened to Leonard? Did he go to the shelter? Is he okay? Leonard's breath caught in his throat. People, strangers, were invested in his journey. They weren't mocking him. They weren't dismissing him. They wanted him to succeed. For the first time, the world wasn't looking at him as a failure. They were rooting for him. Later that night, Leonard sat on his cot, staring at his phone. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent years believing that no one cared, that people only saw him as another nameless figure on the street. But now, because of a single act of kindness, because one teenager had stopped instead of walking past, his story was out in the open, and he had a choice. He could fade back into the background, let the attention die down, and slip away, unnoticed. Or he could prove that he was more than his past. His fingers hovered over the screen as he typed out a message. Still standing, still working, not stopping. And he hit send. Leonard never expected his story to matter. For years he had felt invisible, reduced to nothing more than a forgotten man on the streets. But now, everything had changed. The video of his encounter with Barron Trump had sparked something much bigger than just a moment of kindness. It had ignited a movement. Across the country, people were stepping up to help the homeless, donate to shelters, and even reconnect with lost family members. But for Leonard, this wasn't about the headlines or the internet buzz. This was about proving, to himself, to Paul, to Barron, that he wasn't just another sad story. Every morning he woke up in the shelter, the bed no longer feeling foreign but rather like a reminder of how far he had come. He worked harder at the job site than ever before, pushing himself past the exhaustion, past the self-doubt, past the nagging voice in his head that whispered he wasn't good enough. Because every time he felt himself faltering, he remembered that promise. If I help you today, you have to help yourself tomorrow. Deal? And Leonard was helping himself, one day at a time. It had been weeks since Leonard had last seen Barron in person. Sure, he had received the occasional check-in text, simple, direct, always encouraging, but the teenager had been busy, and Leonard wasn't the kind of man to expect special treatment. So, when the shelter's director tapped him on the shoulder one afternoon and said, "You have a visitor," he wasn't sure what to expect. Walking out into the lobby, he stopped dead in his tracks. There he was, Barron Trump, standing by the front desk, hands in his pockets, that same calm, unreadable expression on his face. But something was different. Maybe it was the way his lips twitched into a knowing smirk when he saw Leonard, or the way his eyes scanned him, as if assessing his progress. "You're looking better," Barron said, nodding slightly. Leonard let out a half laugh. "Guess working a real job does that." Barron studied him for a moment before speaking. "You keep showing up. Every single day." A small nod of approval. "Good." For a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of everything they had been through, everything that had led them to this moment, hung between them. Then, finally, Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. Leonard's stomach twisted. He didn't want another handout. He had come too far to feel like a charity case again. "I don't need..." Barron cut him off with a look. "Relax, it's not money." He handed Leonard the envelope. "It's a job offer." Leonard blinked. "A what?" Barron leaned against the counter, his expression as nonchalant as ever. "There's a program my family's company runs. Helps guys like you get back on their feet with steady work. Real work, something beyond just day labor." His gaze sharpened. "You ready for something like that?" Leonard looked down at the envelope, his fingers tightening around the edges. The offer felt surreal. A few months ago, he was begging for change on a street corner. Now, he was being handed an opportunity he never would have dared to dream of. "You serious?" Leonard's voice was barely above a whisper. Barron shrugged. "I don't waste my time on people who aren't." That hit harder than Leonard expected. He had spent most of his life being dismissed, overlooked, or pitied. But this was something else entirely. This was belief. Slowly he exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, I'm ready." Barron smirked, pushing off the counter. "Then don't waste it." A few days later, Leonard packed up what little he owned and left the shelter for good. His new job wasn't glamorous, but it was his. It was steady, stable, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was building something. Meanwhile, the video of his interaction with Barron continued to ripple across the internet, sparking debates, discussions, and waves of kindness from strangers who saw themselves in Leonard's struggle. Some people would always doubt the sincerity of what happened that day on the street. Some would call it a publicity stunt, a moment of privilege captured for the cameras. But Leonard knew the truth. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about fame. It was about one person choosing to see another. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. At its core, this story isn't just about a homeless man and a billionaire's son. It's about the power of human connection, the strength of second chances, and the simple truth that kindness can change lives. Leonard's journey proves that a single moment of compassion can spark a chain reaction, leading to transformation not just for one person, but for an entire community. In a world often consumed by division and indifference, Barron Trump's act of generosity serves as a reminder that small actions can have a massive impact. So what can we take away from this? That every person has a story worth telling, and sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen. If this inspiring story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And remember, change starts with you. Who will you help today?